When anyone mentions the word intimacy, usually what we think about is a relationship between two people. Usually, if it is in a commercial, it oftentimes has sexual connotations. But there is an intimacy that is far, far beyond simply that relationship between two people, and that is an intimacy with God. And that is the title of this message, Intimacy with God. And I want you to turn, if you will, to Matthew chapter 17, and I want us to read these first 9 verses. Now, you may read this and wonder, well, where do you get intimacy with God from this? So I want us to turn and look at that, if you will, and then we'll find out in just a moment. This is the event of Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration, and he begins by saying, "And 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John, his brother, and brought them up to a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his garments became as white as light. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with him. And Peter answered and said to Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 tabernacles here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. While he was still speaking, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them. And behold, a voice out of the cloud saying, This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. And when the disciples heard this, they fell on their faces and were much afraid. And Jesus came to them and touched them and said, Arise and do not be afraid. And lifting up their eyes, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. And as they were coming down from the mountain, Jesus commanded them, saying, Tell the vision to no one until the Son of Man has risen from the dead. Now Jesus, you recall, had 12 apostles, or 12 disciples as we call them. And yet 3 of these he treated a little different than he did the others. They were sort of called the inner circle. There was an intimacy, I believe, between Jesus and Peter, James, and John that is not to be found with all the other disciples, though he loved them all, I'm sure, taught them many, many things, but there's something about these 3. If you'll notice here in this 17th chapter of Matthew, that of all of his 12 disciples, he only took 3 of them, Peter, James, and John, to what I believe was probably the highlight of Jesus' life in these 3 years of ministry. Now, of course, the baptism was a very important time for him because the Father also manifested himself. Many other things that he did were very important, but if you'll notice here that Jesus is speaking with Moses and Elijah, transfigured in his physical body with a touch of the glory he had before he came and after he ascended. This is a highlight in Jesus' life. He only took the inner circle, Peter, James, and John. Go back, if you will, to Matthew chapter 26. In Matthew chapter 26 is the most traumatic moment in Jesus' life until he is hanging on the cross. And notice what's going on. Verse 36. Then Jesus came with them to the place called Gethsemane and said to his disciples, Sit here while I go over there and pray. Now he's got them all there except Judas. And he took with him, a little distant further, he took with him, not all the 11, but he took with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, that's James and John, and began to be grieved and distressed. And he said to them, so that those 3 could hear him, My soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch with me. Now, when we talk about intimacy, what are we talking about? We're talking about a closeness of relationship, a depth of relationship, a confidentiality, a personal relationship, a relationship of genuine love toward the others. And so usually when we talk about intimacy, we're talking about people's relationship with each other. And there are many, many books out on intimacy, and I think 99.9, if not 100% of them, are about relationships between individuals. I want us to talk about what I know must be in the mind of God the most important thing about his relationship with us and ours with him. That God is not satisfied with simply fellowship. God desires intimacy, closeness, and depth that is so deep and so close, fellowship doesn't even come close to it. Now, I want us to see several things, not necessarily from this passage, but I'm coming back to this passage and look at it more thoroughly. But I want us to look at several things here about this whole idea of intimacy with God. First of all, and that is intimacy with God is the priority in His creation process. That intimacy with God is the priority in His creation process. Look, for example, for a moment at the importance of it as far as the reason or the purpose of the creation. Why did God create us? He created us, first of all, to love us and to be loved by us. He created us in order to be glorified by the lives that we live that would point to Him. And thirdly, He created us to rule over, rule over His creation according to Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. So those are His three primary purposes. And therefore, when you think about it, if He created us to love Him and to be loved in return, He has intimacy in mind. He didn't create us like angels. The second thing I want you to notice about the creation is the pattern He used. In that 26th verse of the first chapter of Genesis, if you'll notice what He says, let us make man in our image according to our likeness. Now, He could have created us like angels, but He didn't. He created us as unique human beings. And what did He do? When He said, let us create man in our own image, He was not talking about anything physical because God is spirit. So He's talking about the image of God as He is as person. That is, He has intellect. He can think and reason. He has emotion. He can feel. He has a will to make choices. God created you and me in order that we may be able to relate to God as He is. We can think as He thinks. Not as full as He can think. We can feel something of what He feels. And that we can reason and make decisions. We have a will by which to make decisions. So